Right, hello, and welcome to BYOB. I'm Alex Waite, the Marketing Director at CHANGEMAKERS, and today we're diving into Scrappy strategy, smart strategy. And one of the things I actually just wanted to clarify at the top of the call was we had a chat with Alan last week, and we just wanted to highlight by saying Scrappy strategy. We're not necessarily saying we're going into founder mode or doing more with less or anything like that. In simplistic form, we're talking about essentially learning to work better with what you've got. We'll be chatting for about 25 minutes during this, and then if we can, we'll get to a few questions during it. So if you have any questions, please do submit them along the way, and we'll do our best to get to them before the end. So today, we want to remove some, if not all, of the dread of doing strategy work. I don't think it will be possible to completely remove it, but often when people hear the word strategy, they immediately start to think about, oh, it's going to be months and months of intense work. And while this is probably the case for the bigger plays, it certainly doesn't have to be the norm. And particularly in the B2B tech world, we all know that time is a luxury. Deadlines and budgets are tight. Expectations for marketing, creative, and brand work are always sky high. But here's the thing: we also know that sound strategy is the foundation of great creative work and businesses thriving. Research beats no research, and any insight is better than guessing. So how do we square this challenge? So today I'm joined by Alan Roll, who's the head of brand creative at Airtable. And he's bringing over 2 decades of creative leadership experience from both in-house client side and also agency side. And also being a fellow strategy geek, he's the perfect person to explore this conversation. So hello, Alan. Welcome to BYOB. How are you?
Hello, Alex, and hello, everyone else. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I've really enjoyed almost every single session today so far. I missed the first 15 minutes of the open, but everything else I've caught, and it's been quite good and very rich in content. So thank you for having us all, and thank you for having me here.
That's a pleasure. And that wasn't even prompted or anything like that. You said that off your own back as well, which is good.
That's right. That's right.
So let's jump into it. So strategy is a pretty broad church. So from a design, brand, and business perspective, what do we mean by strategy, and do you always need it? Just open with a massive question.
Yeah, which is like give me the first, right? I think the best way to think about it, I kind of reflect back on my career and kind of how I've evolved my own thinking over time. And I think there was a diagram that I encountered during my time at Interbrand that was something that we shared at almost every opening client meeting that we had when we were either pitching business or starting on the work. And it was one in which we it showed business strategy and then had spokes coming off of it, and those spokes represented different teams in the business: the workplace, the comms team, the PR team, recruiting, ops, so on and so forth. Marketing obviously being one of them, product obviously being one of them as well. And then that was kind of defined as, okay, this is the old world of corporate identity, where you had these things, and brand was this extension of marketing, right? It was almost the wrapper that you put around the things that you were doing when you're trying to sell your product, right? And that was the old way. The new way was thinking, okay, let's put brand, the business strategy again at the center, but let's wrap that with brand strategy, right? And that becomes the way in which your business ultimately wants to engage with the world, and how can that then be infused across every part of how your teams operate, right? So how does legal use brand? How does product use brand? How does marketing use brand? How does recruiting use brand? So on and so forth, right? It becomes much more of an extension of the business strategy, and therefore it's brand should be and brand strategy specifically should be seen as a business conversation, not necessarily only a creative conversation, right? Creative certainly is an output that comes from it. I think more often than not, we think about the two highly related, because the creative team really needs the brand strategy to be able to execute, to define kind of territories and give it, the sandbox required to explore in the right ways. But so do the other teams, right? And if you think about the best businesses in the world, their brand comes through in ways way more than just identity or marketing. It comes through the products they create. It comes through in the way that they engage with governments and things like that as well. So that is where I like to think about it. It is much more somewhat the glue between all of the different strategies that a business has, and ultimately it connects the dots between what you're trying to do in the world and how you want to show it across every strategy in the business.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's particularly in B2B tech. It's always interesting. Not necessarily. I suppose it is an interesting problem that companies have within it, and the way that brand is sometimes perceived, as you say, through purely being a visual output. It certainly has its place in terms of guiding it, but I agree with you in terms of the importance of raising it up within the company and actually starting to join dots and then showing the true value of what you're doing. And these businesses are built by founders who really know their stuff, and they certainly haven't just gone into business and launched a product or a service without there being some sort of strategy. But then that doesn't always necessarily translate the thinking into, right, okay, well, this is the business, and then actually seeing the brand umbrella over the entire thing.
Yeah, and I would say that it's not surprising, right? You have a lot of really strong entrepreneurs starting a lot of these businesses, and they're going through high growth, and they're figuring things out as they go. Those people may have never worked in a company that actually used that type of thinking, and therefore they haven't necessarily adopted it, or it didn't make sense at the time in which they're building the company, right? Because they're still kind of figuring out some of their foundational things and so on and so forth, right? But again, I think the key value is more of a mental model shift. Like the moment you begin to think about brand through the lens in which you say, you want to think about your brand strategy and your outputs everywhere, it does begin to change the conversation, to not just be one that like, oh, the brand team needs this thing, but we all need this thing. It's going to help actually galvanize and make a more consistent experience for our customers across the board, right? In general, I think the speed at which the marketplace is changing for so many industries, tech is obviously more so than many even right now, specifically because of things like AI or a pandemic or shifting markets conditions, access to capital, so on and so forth. Those things are causing businesses to have to make shifts really quickly, right? And so they look at the idea of like a brand strategy as like, oh, if it's only going to be used to develop this brand identity, then is there a way for me to shortcut it versus any time and attention I need to on it, right? But if you start thinking of it differently and think of it as like, oh, this is not just for the creative team, but this is kind of a part of what will solve a lot of things. What might be marketing content, it might be recruiting, again, so on and so forth. That really helps. And so from a brand strategy practitioner standpoint, I've kind of given up on the model of creating a framework that is durable and can be defined and keep static for a long period of time. And I've started moving towards a model in which you build a canvas that is constantly changing, and you use it as a thing that helps inform when you need to either develop hypotheses, go out and define new things, or wholeheartedly just change things altogether. It just becomes a tool that's different than the one I typically had used beforehand.
No, that's super interesting, and I think that's a really good insight for people to take away is thinking of it in that format, and particularly your point about forming some sort of hypothesis. And I think that the whole idea of this is being a bit more agile or learning to work better with what you've got and being more efficient, I suppose, within what you're doing. And I certainly think starting with a hypothesis gives you a platform to be able to jump out from, right? Because you've either got to prove it or disprove it straight away, or you've got an idea of where you're starting from. So I think that's a really interesting bit, because otherwise I feel like sometimes you think about it, everything becomes so big, it's almost like, well, where do we start with this? And I think that's where people start to switch off from the whole thing, because they're just like, I'm going to need so much investment in this, the buy-in from leadership, time, money, etc., etc. And that's
I think the basic. I mean, I think we all have heard some version of this before in the past, but like if you don't do the work to define your brand and do things specifically to try to form that opinion in your customers, they're going to do it for themselves, right? There's a foundational thinking around, what is the mental model of this company that I have? What is the mental model I have of myself? Do I see myself differently because I engage with this company? That is ultimately what you're trying to do with your customers, right? You're trying to create something where they are so aligned and on board with what you have to offer. They're not willing to just buy today's products, but tomorrow's and everything that you bring out, into the future, right? That doesn't happen by saying I'm not going to focus on it, right? You have to spend some time thinking about it. What was more interesting to me, or maybe the observation I made in looking at that diagram I was describing earlier, was we spend so much time defining what the brand will define, but we don't actually think about it always in context of what are all those other strategies defining, right? And so I think the canvas that I've begun thinking about is less about just defining brand strategy, but making sure that you see it at the same time as you're seeing the other strategies. So your go-to-market strategy, what is your ultimate market that you're entering? Who's the core customer? How big are they? What does the TAM actually look like? How do you make sure that those are all kind of on the same canvas with the thing that you're trying to define, and spend the time connecting those dots?
Yeah, definitely. And it completely makes sense in terms of giving yourself the foundation for it. So as a leader, how do you go about doing that internally? Like going around the different, various departments, identifying the right people and taking the stakeholders on this journey as such?
Yeah, I mean, and this is maybe one where this is a true sense of bird in hand kind of resource thinking, right? This is using the resources in front of you. This isn't going off and saying, well, I don't have this thing, I now need this person to go make this thing for me. It's, go have a conversation and just say, like, how are we identifying this today, right? Who is the right person for me to talk to? Okay, great. I'm going to put it on the canvas in its raw form. It may not be documented in something that's shared with everybody in the business, as gospel at the moment, but putting it on the canvas and then just showing where the alignments are and aren't is kind of step one, right? So it doesn't take a lot. It's, it's like a handful of maybe half an hour conversations with folks, and then just, get into a Fig Jam or Miro or whatever tool you're using to do kind of large canvas kind of thinking, and just put it all on the table, and then ultimately, pretty quickly you start to see where things are adding up. And I use a construct it's very familiar to engineers, and this was developed at a company that was very engineering driven, was this idea of like, if this blank and this situation exists, then this, right? And I use that kind of construct throughout the canvas and say, okay, are these things adding up, right? Yeah. So if our mission is this and our product vision is defined as this, then the promise we're going to make to our customers looks like this, or the claims we want to make, from a legal standpoint, are this, right? So on and so forth. We did that work early on when I first started at Airtable, not to be able to share that across the business and say, let's define our overall brand strategy together, but more as can we see where things are not aligned, right? Because we recognize that the business thinking and the product vision was getting out ahead of where the brand was at the moment, but we didn't know exactly where we needed to go because we didn't have this kind of codified brand strategy, and it wasn't the right time to even go and do that because it was likely going to shift given how much was changing in the world around us, right? And so we just use it more as a way to say, where are we so out of alignment that we really need to spend a lot of attention? And where do we have the right alignment and that's working, and therefore let's preserve those ideas, and that became a nice way to begin to just put some things on the table with the various folks that we were working with when we did our brand evolution, and say, hey, this is what we're going to use to guide us. We don't have to agree on all the words. We don't have to agree on the structure of framework, but we need to agree that these are the right guiding principles, right? And it gave us enough to kind of move forward and make some decisions. And we were able to revisit that canvas and ultimately say, what were the conditions that have changed since we did that? And how important is it that we react to that change? And how big of a reaction should that be, right?
Yeah.
And so we use it kind of as a living document. Again, it's scaffolding. It's less important how durable each of the pieces are. It's almost a very honest blueprint of like where you are and where you could be based on, things that are changing.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that in particular what you're saying with lots of internal collaboration on things is being able to, again, thinking smart and making use of what you've got, being able to review things, go to internal stakeholders and have a look at things to almost get a base layer of where you want to be. Because again, I think sometimes this, the perception with strategy is a lot of the intel that you need is external. When obviously, and like you said, you rightly said, with customers and ultimately it's, you're trying to influence what's in the minds of your audiences, that you obviously do need a bit of external for some things, but not everything. And so again, in terms of, like you said, there's obviously plenty of information within businesses that's accessible to you, that's hugely valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think strategy in general. This goes back to my inner brand days as well. You always discovery happens through the lens of company, category, and customer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, you're looking for observations that add up to insights that help you make some decisions. You have plenty of information already captured in those three buckets within the company if you just know where to look. Yeah. Today, it's even more accessible because we could use things like AI to help us, organize it, collate it, summarize it wherever we need to. So we don't necessarily have to skip that work just because we can't go out and do a really robust research study, right? And it still shows up in both quantitative and qualitative ways. So you can still feel like you have the right rigor, but you're really looking for directional guidance anyway, right? Mm-hmm. So that part should still happen. Ultimately, you're looking for like what makes us authentic, what is relevant to our customer, and how is that differentiated in the market, right? Like if the thing that you're putting out there isn't at the intersection of those ideas, then you're really not doing brand strategy in the right way anyway, right? Like you have to do that. It's not going to be a lever that you can pull anywhere in the business to turn into any impact if you're not kind of, checking those boxes, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this is like, those things still hold true, right? So I'm just putting a different way of looking at it and maintaining it over time. My job as kind of brand shepherd is different when you have a field of things to look at in a very kind of structured way that make it easier for you to kind of manage it over time.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that. And I completely agree with you that it's very easy to miss, which sounds really obvious, but it's very easy to miss the external view or the view of the market or where you're trying to make money when you do this type of thing as well. And it's really easy to get lost in almost being too insular, looking at yourself. And obviously you do need to look at yourself in terms of, what makes you unique, special, how you're going to differentiate yourself, etc. But all within the wider context of the market and the category and other bits as well. So we talked about this canvas and blueprint. So what are sort of the main things that you're looking for which go into that?
Yeah, so I think, I typically work in a very, left to right kind of way. And at the far left side are things I would consider the foundational things, right? These are the things that really should be protected for longer bits of time. These are like, what is your vision, your mission, your belief system? I like to use beliefs. I think values are very useful. Values tend to be a little bit more inwardly focused, where I think beliefs are a little bit more around storytelling and are really helpful in terms of like being able to articulate who you are and what you stand for. And I also think that if you're looking at your customers, you need to understand where you have overlaps in beliefs, meaning like if you're sharing those core beliefs with your customers, you're going to have way more success, right? And so I think it's worth kind of identifying what those are. So that's the kind of like what I would say is on the far left side of your canvas. Mm-hmm. As you move your way right, you're ultimately going to get more and more focused on strategies that are about outwardly facing things, right? what I find people typically forget to look at, or maybe didn't forget to, but just don't always think about connecting the dots to, is the kind of more traditional kind of business strategy side of things. Like, who are we trying, like, what is the market we're in? What products are we selling? Who do we think we can win with? How big is that audience, right? Who is brand really going to matter with? So on and so forth. Let's make sure that that is on the canvas, right? Because that is something that, you know, I think sometimes we take for given that people understand that, but I don't think that we actually have it spelled out in detail in a way that helps everyone who cares about brand kind of understand how those things connect. So I think that's a critical part. I think product vision is another one. Like, how are we defining the products we're making today? How are we defining what comes next? Understanding what that means from a roadmap standpoint, right? Like, just even if it's just relatively, you know, simple at that point, at that level, I think it's certainly useful to understand that if and then statement, right? And then you can get into things that are a little bit more like marketing driven, you know, which might be, you know, more focused on like, what are you promising? What are you claiming? You know, what is the proof that you want to take to market, which will show up in things like messaging and you know, value prop statements and stuff like that. And then ultimately that will turn into the other parts of it, which we are, you know, for the creatives on the call, we all know those things. That's like experience strategy, you know, personality attributes, you know, voice and tone, so on and so forth, right? The one thing that sometimes gets overlooked, and I think is also worth acknowledging, is what is the employee value proposition? So for your employer brand, like, what are we actually asking people to give to the company in terms of what they get from it, right? And like, how does that galvanize the people who are there to be, you know, proponents of the brand as well? I'm sure we've heard the best brands are built from the inside out. I think that's the thing that if you put that on the canvas, then you can kind of walk the walk a little bit with the strategy side of things. There's other things in there. It depends on the industry you're in. Certainly go-to-market strategy is another one that it should be accounted for in various ways in the canvas, but it depends on your business and how you think about go-to-market strategy. Sometimes brand is part of a go-to-market strategy canvas versus the other way around. But if you're not connecting the dots in some way, then I would recommend you throw that on there as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, awesome advice. I think particularly the bit that's really resonating with me is the connecting the dots. I think in the idea of being smart strategy in particular, you can have the best laid strategy in the world, the best idea, but if you're not bringing people on that journey, right? And it's only as good as getting people bought into it, doing something that's simple, connecting dots, recognizable, that people are going to be able to look at and go, I get it. Yeah, I love what we're doing that. And they feel bought into the journey as well, particularly with how you're talking about relevant stakeholders from different departments, getting everyone in, getting this canvas where everyone can have a look at it and work from there. It's got to work wonders in terms of actually getting, because the strategy is one thing, actually enacting the strategy, I suppose, is another thing which is completely different.
Yeah, I was having a chat with the former head of strategy at an agency, which I won't name, but and he's forming a new agency himself, formed in that basic idea, which was, 90% of strategy efforts fail, and not because the strategy wasn't sound, but because the plan to execute was not part of the complete plan, right? So, and if you can turn the tides on that, you could probably get to at least a 50 or 60% success rate if you make that a little bit more tangible. And so that's kind of why it is that left to right canvas. On the far right, it is much more tactical strategies that you want to have in place, and you want to be able to say, hey, if and this, right? Like all the way down the entire canvas, and you feel pretty good about it, then you should be able to do some pretty magical stuff with it, right?
I like that. I like the way you're putting it in that sequence and potentially appealing to more, I suppose, product or like focused mindsets that will look at things in that particular way and be able to actually look at it, relate, and go, yeah, okay, I get that. And it takes it away. It brings it into being something more actionable as, I suppose, brand. Like the worst bit is if articulated wrong, it tends up being this, could be seen as this fluffy concept, which is 100% not. It's one of the most valuable business tools ever, created, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it still boggles the mind a little bit that we're still having the conversation around, brand as an extension of marketing versus brand as a core part of the business strategy, right? I think that's been something that has been pushed for a number of years. And I think I'd love to see a day when that just is dogma and we're not relitigating it again. But it's amazing when you open that door, right? When you shift that mindset, when you change the mental model of how you want to use and leverage both brand and brand strategy, it does kind of change the story a little bit.
Yeah, it does. We've had a question come in, which is along these exact lines, saying that you mentioned that strategy is a business-wide approach. On the whole, do you think business leaders understand the importance? And if not, what's the strongest business argument for brand strategy for the non-believers?
Man, I think in general, starting the conversation basically with just a way of building the mental model is one way to get started with it. Mm-hmm. Everybody's going to want proof, right? And I think if you start looking at and thinking about the most successful brands throughout time through the lens of how are they looking at brand and how well is it coming through, even if they're not, saying, okay, that's how we look at it or so on and so forth, but you can see it come through, then you can ultimately the success is there. I think about, I'll use examples that we all know. Apple, overly used example, it exudes itself from the core, right? Almost to the point where it feels almost natural that they probably aren't even talking about it because it's just part of their culture, right? Yeah. But they very rarely will do anything that feels out of mark, Nike, who's another brand that I am a huge proponent of. I'm kind of brand geeks around both those brands, but Nike's a big one. More recently, they've kind of gone against things that were part of what I would say core belief stuff, and they've got a little quiet around some of those things. And ultimately, they've made decisions recently to kind of change leadership and so on and so forth. And I imagine you'll see them shift back towards things that are a little bit more core to who they are, So when you see examples like that, it's easier to kind of be inspired by them. I think it's harder when it's not just part of the conversation around what is our strategy, right? If the only time it comes up is when we're talking about brand identity, then you're never going to get it out of that world of, oh, this is about creative, this is not about the rest of the business.
Yeah, definitely. And particularly some of the points that you touched on earlier in terms of whether it's employer branding, it carries huge weight in terms of the talent that's attracted to businesses as well, depending on the brand. It's the equity in the brand as well, isn't it? It's the value on top of the products and services and the people there. It's that extra, percentage point on top of that. It's pricing power. It's there's so many good things within this. There's lots of good conversations to be had around that for sure. We've had another one come in which says, is there one principle from your brand agency days that you've had to rethink in order to embrace more agile strategic thinking?
I think that idea of okay, we need to go first in this kind of waterfall way of saying, let's define this brand. Let's build the brand house or the brand pyramid or whatever this thing is. And let's lock that in before we start doing the work. I think that is kind of at the core of our conversation today. It isn't about locking that down as much as putting together a hypothesis and having a framework for change, right? And I think we began that work when I was at the agency in terms of building kind of what does it mean to be a living brand? What does it mean to have a either fixed or flexed, framework around what we will do, how close is it to the core of our brand, how close is it to extending into new equity and so on and so forth. And I think that was a lot of the right first steps. Mm-hmm. I think part of the thinking that went into my approach now was formed by working with companies that are very early stage or in the process of going through rapid growth, in which those foundational things are less formed and less fixed, and you do have to move quicker and you do have to kind of change more often. That's kind of where I would say, hey, I threw away a little bit of the old playbook and moved here. Now, I'm not to say like that's not, I don't want to recommend that for everybody, because some companies that if you have a very established go-to-market strategy and it's proven itself and it really works, right? You should totally go and have a more defined and formalized and doctrine and mantra kind of brand strategy that the company can all repeat in their sleep, right? Like I think that is still the right way to look at it, because it's the thing that makes it more part of culture than anything else, right? But for companies that need to move quicker, getting everybody on the same page all the time is not tenable, really. And so just having a way through which you at least shepherd those ideas and organize them has been useful for me, at least.
Brilliant. Sorry, just so it's something that we could talk about for hours, but we're sadly out of time for this. And being the marketing lead at Shape, I can't be the only presenter to run over time, so we better keep it.
All right. Well, I'll leave everyone with one thought. I'll take off my strategy hat, put on my creative hat. I think what I would recommend is go through this process, learn everything that's on the canvas, creative people, and then put that aside and go and create, right? I think if you learn everything and it's in your back of your head, kind of like the Stefan Sagmeister guidance there, put it aside, forget about it, it'll come out. But if you don't have it in your head, it's not going to help your creative. So my last bit of advice there. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, Alex.
No, really appreciate your time and wisdom today, Alan. It's been a pleasure. And to everyone else, we'll be releasing the takeaways, and the sessions will be going on the Shape by site alongside the videos next week if you want to dive back into it. Up next to anchor the first day, we've got Why Weirdness Works in B2B with Ryan Anderson, the head of product marketing at Zapier, and it's hosted by Nick Farrer, the founder of ShapeBuy. So if you're hanging around to see the next session, we'll see you there.
I'm excited for it. I'll see you all there.
Cheers.